Hello, everyone. I'm Sean Roberts. I'm a linguist at Cardiff University in Wales, and welcome to our Berlin Ao Vivo Linguists Online, which is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dr. Balthasar Bickel, Professor of General Linguistics at the Department of Comparative Language Science at the University of Zurich. He's the leader of the Distributional Linguistics Lab. He's the director of the Swiss Research Consortium Evolving Language, and he's part of the team that assembled the autotype database. And for me, what makes him an exciting researcher is that he combines this high-level directing of research with very hands-on fieldwork and computational analysis. And this allows him to go where the research takes him. So today he's going to talk to us about evolutionary biases in language, and we'd like to thank him for his contribution. Reminder for everyone listening along that questions can be asked in the chat and we'll try and answer them at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Balthasar Bickel. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sean, for this kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to be here and to give a bit of an overview of the kind of research that we're doing in our lab and what keeps me going in the language sciences. So it's often been remarked and noted that a language is really a biocultural hybrid. It's a system that is both the product of cultural evolution over historical time and the product of biological evolution over geological time. And the question that is really at the forefront for many of us is like, what's what? Which aspects of language are really the product of our biology, of what we inherited as primates, and what is part of the processes of cultural diversification that our species is known to have undergone and that keeps undergoing as we speak. So what's what? Now, a seemingly obvious answer is to point to what's called universals and to say, well, look, I mean, if we know what's invariant for human languages, what is precisely not subject to cultural variation, that is the part that's probably set by our biology. Now, in the past 10 or 15 years or so, it's become increasingly clear that this notion of universals is fraught with enormous difficulties. Let me highlight a few of them. One is this notion of the false positive probability in making statements that are meant to be universal. So the idea is that if you sample 100 languages or so, there is a very high probability that you make a false inference. For instance, you will with all likelihood conclude that, for instance, object initial languages don't exist if you've seen only 100 languages. Now, obviously, if you sample more languages, that probability of making false inferences goes down. And some time ago, Piantadosi and Gibson made a series of nice simulations where they asked the question, so how many languages do you have to see before your false positive probability falls below a conventional threshold of, say, 1%? This is something we can live with. Most sciences have such thresholds, that's fine. Now, what they found is that you reach a threshold below 1% only if you have seen about 500 languages. And that is under ideal artificial conditions where you pre-screened your data set and emphasized rare and exotic features. That's what's called independent sample here in the graph. Now you think, okay, then let's just sample 500 languages, but there is a slight problem because these need to be statistically independent. Otherwise, the whole logic falls apart. Now, we don't have 500 independent languages on this planet, and we have only one planet. We have, according to Glottolog, there are only 427 language families. That's less than we need. And this figure, if anything, will go down because we keep discovering relationships between languages. So we'll have even less independent cases. Now, with findings like these, many of us have sort of given up on this notion of absolute statements about what exists or doesn't exist in human language, and have turned to a notion of preferences, statistical preferences, biases, or whatever. But actually, things don't get much better there. The following map shows you two things. The first I want to focus on is when languages have the same color, so dots have exactly the same color, that means they belong to the same family here on this map. Now, what the map reminds us of is that in many parts of the world, a few language families have spread so heavily that they removed all diversity that must have been there before these spreads. So for instance, in Africa, the Bantu subpart of Niger-Congo spread over pretty much all of sub-Saharan Africa and removed everything that was there. That spread happened in the last 10,000 years, much younger in this case, but we have no idea what kind of diversity was there. Or take Australia, the Pama-Nyungan spread. It's removed pretty much all diversity that used to be there. This means that just looking at frequency distributions in the current world might completely be a distorted picture. It might be entirely driven by the recent population history and doesn't tell us much about what's typical or common or frequent for human language as a species property. So challenging this idea of just inferring something about our biological faculty from looking at distributions. The map shows yet another thing, just as important. When dots have not exactly the same, but similar colors, in this map, it means that the families that these dots belong to have similar structural properties. In this case, actually similar grammar properties that I took from existing databases. Now, what you can see is that there are large parts of the map, for instance, the bigger chunk of Eastern Eurasia all the way to Sinai Tibetan in Southeast Asia have similar colors with a few interesting exceptions. Or in the Americas, North America and South America, the eastern parts have similar colors. It's different on the western coasts. What these suggest, just visually, without proper testing, is that there are possible effects of contact between language families over large areas, potentially ancient ones, which again make the point that population history in these areas has changed, is likely to have changed the frequency distributions. So again, taking the current frequency distributions and making inferences might just be inferences about the recent human history and not about the language faculty as we've had it over, say, 300,000 years, the currently assumed age of our species. We probed this idea a bit further in a recent case study where we focused on Northeast Asia and looked at population history through the lens of genetics, where you can reconstruct population history to a fair extent, also deeper in time, and have some idea who was in contact with whom when. And we asked, what traces did this leave to the frequency distributions in grammar, and compared this to the frequency distributions in the lexicon, in phonology, and for the sake of comparison, also with musical features. What we found is that the most striking, actually the only really robust correlation, was between population history and the distribution of grammatical features, which suggests that indeed what I just said before as an interpretation of a visualization actually has some ground to it, namely that indeed genetically reconstructible population history has an effect on the distribution of grammatical features. In this case, it was after controlling for current locations of languages and after controlling for relationships of languages within families. So the signal we get goes above and beyond what we see currently. It's directly based on what must have been the case in prehistory as we can reconstruct it through the genetics. So this means that the current frequency distributions mostly are shaped by the population history of the speakers that spoke these languages in the past. Now, the lesson that we can draw from this is the following. If you see a map like this, where you have verb initial, red languages versus others. Now, linguists have been prone to interpret maps like these by saying, that's interesting, look, blue dominates so clearly, so probably there is something against verb initial languages. Maybe the human language faculty, maybe because of our biological equipment, verb initial languages are this preferred, and we can now start to interpret and think about this. But who knows? Maybe it was the other way around. Maybe red dominated the earth for 300,000 years, and it's only after the recent population historical movements, after the contact events of the kind that we reconstructed in Northeast Asia, maybe after the spreads of large families in the wake of agriculture, or the spread of Palm-Jungen without agriculture, doesn't matter, that these just change the frequency distributions, and what we see now is really not typical of our species, but is typical of the past 10,000 years. Or take the opposite of this. When we see maps like these, SOV versus SVO orders, most linguists are prone to say, well, look, this is probably distributed because of language contact and the spread of a few language families. It seems there's nothing universal going on, universal preference. But again, who knows? Maybe indeed what we see is the outcome of just very recent history. And there is, and even though currently neither blue nor red dominates, maybe in the past something did dominate. Maybe SVO dominated, and there might be even a reason for that, because it minimizes the distances between the verb and its arguments, as opposed to SOV, which doesn't do this as well. I don't know, and we don't know. The point I want to make with these introductory findings and observations and conclusions is that we should maybe stop looking at maps, counting frequencies now, and then making stories about what might have been the biological foundation of this or the universal behind this. So I want to propose that we move from counting and interpreting language types and their frequency distributions as we see them to what I call evolutionary biases. What I mean by this is that we start from like the other end, that we start from what we know about the biological conditions or the cultural conditions of language, and think how these conditions might have caused or might continue to cause biases in how languages change over time, tilt the way they evolve over historical time. And I'm not interested whether this is universal or not. All I'm interested in whether there is a plausible causal link. Now that's of course a tall order, and I don't think we are there with any single case, but it's a program that I want to submit is worth pursuing. And what I want to do in this talk now is to give two case studies where I think we are getting close to theories of an evolutionary bias, which has some grounding to it and is worth exploring further and testing and retesting as we go. The first one relates food, a biological phenomenon, with sounds, and specifically with a certain sound type, the labiodentals. The second, this will be short. The second, more extensive case study relates something about our perception system, visual perception, also auditory perception, with properties in grammar, specifically how grammars encode agents. So let me turn first to the case study on food and sounds. We start with something in the biology. If you look at how byte configurations develop in the first, between infancy and adolescence, across primates, be it gibbons or humans, doesn't matter, you find a standard natural development. And that is that we start out, among all us primates, with a overbite or overjet configuration where the upper teeth are a little bit in front of the lower teeth. Now, because of tear and wear over time, this gets just that these are standard biomechanical mechanisms, you end up with an edge-to-edge bite where the two teeth align, as in the picture on the right on the slide. That's a standard mechanisms, affects all primates, is well established in the anthropological literature. Now, in a study that we published a couple of years ago, we looked at the effect that one of the most important cultural innovations of our species had on this, that is agriculture. Agriculture, of course, changed everything for us as a species, but one thing in particular that is interesting is that they changed the kind of food that we have access to. With agriculture comes the need for storage. With agriculture comes the need for pre-processing food. And one of the immediate inventions that come with agriculture is grinding, milling, even at an industrial scale, starting with antiquity. This meant that softer foods became available to more and more parts of the population. It's obviously a gradual process that took quite a while, but it did happen. Now, one of the effects that softer food has on our bite configuration is that this natural development that I mentioned before, from overbite to edge, stops happening. That is, the overbite configuration starts to persist because there is no more wear and tear to the extent needed so that teeth are moved into the edge-to-edge position biomechanically. It doesn't happen anymore. In fact, we persist on this overbite configuration to such an extent that if somebody has an edge-to-edge bite today, your dentist will call you and try to sell you braces because it's not considered beautiful anymore. The picture I took there on the right is that what's now considered beautiful because I took it from an ad from an orthodontist. Right? This is the new norm. Now, it has an effect, and the effect it has on language is what we studied next, because we did biomechanical, was Scott Moisick from our team did biomechanical simulations of the production of P sounds, bilabial sounds, and F sounds, labiodentals, under the overbite overjet configuration on the left-hand side and the edge-to-edge bite configuration on the right-hand side. This has enormous effects on many things. For instance, muscle effort is stronger for F sounds under the edge-to-edge bite configuration. But what I want to focus on today is that under the edge-to-edge bite configuration, the articulation of P and F are fairly distant from each other. The actual distance between tooth and also upper tooth and the lower lip is different, is far away, is greater than in the overbite overjet configuration. As you see in the graph, the distance between P and F is virtually nil in the overbite and overjet configuration. What this means is that when you pronounce a B nowadays, chances are that you mispronounce, that you slip into pronouncing an F and producing a labiodental sound instead. And so we developed from this the hypothesis as a causal mechanisms that as soon as you have overbite and overjet persisting into adulthood, that the chances increase that you slip into, well, a sound change from P to F because you mispronounce, and then the usual mechanisms of sound change kick in. It's misheard. The intended sound P is misunderstood as being an F because actually it was an F that was produced. And so this should lead to a change in the dynamics of languages so that it becomes now more probable when languages evolve over time that they develop labiodentals, and when they have them, that they stay on to the extent that food production increases and access to softer foods spread over larger parts of the population. Now, we tested this with a method that's becoming more and more standard in the field. And that's one that looks at synchronic distributions of data in a family, takes trees, simulates potential histories that produce the outcome, namely the current distribution, and make an inference from that on the most likely diachronic model that gave rise to this. So for instance, in this case, where you have red and blue, a model could be like the one with transition probabilities, where it's much more likely for languages in the red state to stay in the red state than to develop in the blue state. And if you are in the blue state, it's much more likely to move over to the red state than to stay in the blue state. This was used first for grammar data by Michael Dunn and colleagues about 10 years ago. And we have since added to this method another tool from biology, that's stochastic character mapping, which is in the lower left, which allows you to reconstruct the probabilities at any given time in the history of the family for a certain trait based on the data you see, the tree you see, and the model you fit on these data. Now, with this method in hand, we could go back to the data. Here we went back to correspondence sets of the kind that Indo-Europeanists, and Paul Whitmer in the team is an Indo-European specialist, that we have in the field. So for instance, Proto-Indo-European P has different reflexes, sometimes labiodental or not, Grimm's law, right? In Germanic, it turned into F, in the others it didn't. And the same can be said for a whole series of other correspondence classes that showed up as labiodentals in some languages. Here is the data that we looked at. We made these stochastic character mappings, reconstructing the probability of sound to be labiodental or not at any given time in history, and then put this all together in the graph you see now. And what was striking, of course, is that it confirms our prediction that, namely, over time, as agriculture and therefore food production and access to softer food spread among the speakers of Indo-European, the more it was likely that sounds became labiodental. So what you see here is we started from something in the biology. We saw that a cultural innovation like agriculture changed that nature, and that nature in turn changed the cultural evolution. So now we are able to tease apart the biological and the cultural factors that shape current languages, not interpreting frequency counts of current distributions, but actually modeling the generative processes that led to the current frequencies. So this concludes my first case study, and I hope it gives you a flavor of the kind of thing I have in mind when I talk about the evolutionary biases. The second case study I want to go on is a bit more challenging because it tries to relate principles of perception grounded in biology, neurobiology, and principles of grammar. Here is about how we encode and how we position agent expressions in language. Like in the case study on labiodentals, I will start with something about that has nothing to do with language. And we go back into one of the famous findings of cognitive and perception psychology from the last century. In the late 40s, Albert Michot proposed that causality is a fundamental principle of human perception. And what he noticed is that people and already infants with 3 months of age, very early on, distinguish between causal and non-causal events. They perceive the difference. You can easily imagine this if you take the example on the right-hand side, where you have on the one hand, you have what's called a control display, where 2 dots move randomly around the screen, just in any order. And then the other screen is what's called the chasing display, where one of the dots always moves behind the other one. You will interpret this one as suggesting that the A dot chases the B dot, and so that there is an agency, that the A dot does something. There is a causal relationship between the motion of B and the motion of A, or in the display with squares and circles, right? If the square goes to the circle and then pushes it, and then I use the word push because you perceive a causal event and you attribute agency to the square. Kids infants as young as 3 months can distinguish this. Other primates can distinguish this. For instance, this has been tested with chimpanzees. They can distinguish between causal and non-causal events. So here the display was a hand coming onto a table, grabbing it all, moving it away, as opposed to a hand moving towards the table and then the doll moving away without contact and without any causal relationship between the two events. Apes are sensitive to this distinction. Now, about 10 years ago, a very interesting paper appeared that probed this a little bit further and added a very important aspect, actually 2 important aspects. The first is that they looked at chicken, so really far away phylogenetically from humans or other primates. And second, they looked not just as the causal, non-causal distinction, but they asked, what does the perception system prefer, the agent or the patient, the chaser or the chasee, as we saw in the display before? So they used the classical design of the experiment that Michot pioneered. So a dot A moves to B, touches B, and then B moves away. The way they implemented the experiment was they took freshly hatched chicken, which are visually completely naive. They haven't seen anything. They are imprinted on 2 dots, A and B, differentiated by colors or shape or both. And then they were tested on this display, just presented to them, they presented to them this causal event. And then they let the chicken choose which side they would walk to in an experimental setup, so that they could go to the A dot, say the blue dot, or to the B dot, say the red dot, which they were imprinted on as different. And what they found is that with overwhelming probability, freshly hatched chickens would prefer to move to the agent. So there seems to be more than just the ability to distinguish causal and non-causal, but indeed a preference for the agents in chicken. Now, that's far away. So we started to look at primates. And in an ongoing experiment, so this is really preliminary, we did experiments on event perception in different primate species. We showed apes and humans short video clips with an agent doing something to a patient, and then track their gaze, as you can see in here. So here is a chimpanzee looking, and now it starts, and you see the dots is where the chimp is looking at and the probability. And we measured many things. One thing we measured is the time it takes the subject to focus on one of the two participants. And we found that across species, there is a preference for agents. They look, everybody, us including, we look at agents faster than at patients. So we seem to prefer them a bit like the chicken do. In a parallel study, we use touch screens where you again see these little clips, and subjects were asked to touch one of the participants, and then looked at the choices. And what we found that if the clips include animates, so two apes or two humans, something like that, we found that for orangutans and humans, there is a preference. For animates, it's not very strong. For agents, it's not very strong, but it's there. With gorillas, we don't know yet. The sample size is too small. Within animates, the effect disappears. So at least for animate reference, it seems that we have a preference for agents in our perception system. It's nothing to do with language. In fact, there is a study that we recently adopted from another tradition that probed into this non-linguistic nature of this preference. And this is what's called a brief exposure experiment. What this is that you flash participants a picture very briefly, like this. This was really brief. You probably didn't see much. It was 300 milliseconds. This is all subjects saw. And the question was, so after seeing this, now describe the participants. And also we looked at where the gaze fell during the presentation, during this very brief exposure of 300 milliseconds. And what Arate, in her work towards her PhD in our lab, found is that speakers look more at agents than patients in these 300 milliseconds. That's even less than it needs, than you need in order to even plan a word. Right? This is really, really short. So there's not much linguistic processing going on in this brief amount of it. It's pure perception. They gaze at agents more than patients. There are differences between languages. Here we looked at whether there's a difference between Basque and Spanish, because Basque is interesting in this regard because an extra case marker for agents. But there is a difference. It's an interesting one. But for now, I focus on the main difference between agents and patients. It's also there in probe recognition. So we have to, was this person in the picture or was that person in the picture? They're much better at guessing the agents than the patients. Also, the verbal descriptions they can give after the presentations are more precise for agents than patients. So we asked ourselves, well, okay, so if this is a perception principle of preferring the agent that we share with birds and other primates, that is pre-linguistic because it happens so rapidly, might it have an effect on the comprehension system when we hear or read linguistic input? And this brought us back to experiments we did long ago, where we had we didn't know much about these biological perception principles, and the experiment were about what speakers or listeners or readers do when processing a noun phrase that is ambiguous as to whether it's an agent or patient, what they do with these noun phrases before they see a verb, and then what they do when they see the verb. So here is the basic design. That's from Lu Ming Wang's dissertation. We presented subjects with stimuli of the following kind, like novel and then understood. So here novel turns out to be a patient in the end, and then actor understood or novel educated, in which case the verb makes clear that the first noun phrase was an agent. Now, what we found is that at the position of the verb, when listeners or readers in this case first saw novel and then they get understood, you get an N400 effect in the EEG signal. An N400 effect is what you generally get when something about the expectation, something about the prediction that the brain made is falsified, doesn't turn out. And we interpreted this at the time, and still now it's consistent with what I just said, that the comprehension system seems to first assume that the first noun phrase is an agent. And then when it isn't at the position of the verb, then you get this N400 effect. Something went wrong, right? The prediction was wrong, the assumption was wrong. And you need to update your model about the sentence. Now, the idea is that perhaps this is a direct reflex of this agent preference that we saw on the purely perceptual ground, because language comprehension also starts with a low-level perception, and only then you get to full interpretations. Now, the experiment in Chinese was always a bit problematic because those of you who know Chinese will know that novel understood is not really canonical. It's only in very specific circumstances that you can utter such a sentence. So we turned to other languages to see whether we could replicate this. And one language we looked at was Hindi. And Hindi is interesting because you can get unmarked, that is nominative noun phrases like book, and they are quite common in the patient role. But then when you put them in a context, like the blue one, you have book. This could be an agent or a patient in Hindi. But then when you get to the verb, in this case, it would have to be a patient. The book was sold, or someone sold the book. As opposed to an unambiguous sentence like the red one, the book accusative, the accusative case tells you it's a patient, and then sell, yeah, that just confirms your expectation. Of course, it was a patient, nothing special. Again, we saw the N400 effect that I showed you in Chinese. So again, it seems to be the case that the processing system transiently and very briefly, on seeing the word book, assumes it's an agent, and then when it gets to the verb, a few milliseconds afterwards, it sort of gets disappointed and there is an N400 effect, just as what we saw before. Now, one could argue, well, perhaps it's just more common for noun phrases like book to be agents. And so then the system gets surprised, but that's unlikely. A book is not a good agent. We tested this in corpora. If you look, we looked at the stimuli in universal dependencies corpora and found the probability of such nouns to be patients is much higher than the probability of them being agents. Also, we have thought, well, maybe it's just because the verb is transitive and the system assumes, well, it should be intransitive, but no, in these stimuli, actually, in most cases, it's much more probable that the verb actually is transitive after having seen the noun phrase that we presented in the experiment. So this can't really explain it. And even more striking, recent work by PhD student Eva Hoover showed that actually, if you look at the surprisal in an information theoretical sense built on language models, you find that after seeing the accusative, the verb is more surprising than after seeing the nominative, which suggests that this couldn't explain the N400 we get. In fact, it gives new credence to the interpretation that we proposed at the time, namely that you have a short, transient interpretation of the first NP as an agent, and that gets corrected when you get to the patient. Still, it's Hindi. And you might argue, well, Hindi is special because you don't have, you have different case systems in the past and in the present and so on. It might be complicated. And anyway, we went on and we are currently looking at Basque. Basque is interesting because you can do these experiments within intransitives. So we don't have to look at transitives. You can take a single noun phrase because Basque is well known for its split here. For instance, the verb injure, takes patient argument in the intransitive, a so-called unaccusative verb, right? And then you get the nominative case, and a verb like travel is so-called unergative verb, takes agentive an agentive participant that is coded as an ergative. Now, nicely for us as experimentalists, BASC has ambiguous case forms. And this ambiguous case form is ambiguous between a reading of ergative singular and nominative plural. On the ergative singular, it denotes an agent. On the nominative plural, it denotes a patient. You could insert this in the sentences above. So you can continue this boy, ergative, traveled, or these boys, patient, got injured. And so we ran the same experiment, the same style of experiment that I showed before, and probed to what extent we see an effect at the position of the verb, where the role is disambiguated, whether or not it's an agent or a patient. Now, before showing you the result, I want to emphasize one thing. Independently of us, another team last year published a paper where they showed that when you present people noun phrases like this on their own without any sentential context, just these boys, they added some stuff before them, some genitive expressions before, some adjectives before, but no verb. It's not embedded in a sentence. When you do this and ask them, so what is it? Is this a plural, right? Are there many boys or one? So agent, singular, or patient, plural. There is a strong preference for people to interpret this as a patient. So they say it's a plural case for the patient and not the ergative singular. That's the default interpretation. Now, to our great surprise, in the EEG experiment, what we see is a disambiguation effect towards the patient reading. So the brain transiently, very briefly, seems to assume that these noun phrases denote agents, and then when the verb tells you it's a patient, then you get this N400 effect. And this happens even though in offline interpretation, just thinking about what this phrase means, there is a default interpretation of this denoting plural patients rather than singular agents. So this shows again that maybe there is a perception principle that happens very rapidly upon seeing this noun phrase or upon hearing this noun phrase very quickly, and has nothing to do with the later integration of the interpretations after processing the sentence. We went on, we thought, well, so Basque, Hindi, all fine, but what about object initial languages, language that canonically put the patient first? Sebastian Saupe, postdoc in my lab, went to the Solomon Islands, where you have such a language. We looked at the corpus data and again found that, look, it's indeed, as suspected, initial noun phrases tend to be patients. And again, we got the same effect. So even though the experience of the speakers, what they learned, what they are exposed to daily, teaches them an initial noun phrase typically is a patient, when the verb actually says it's a patient, you get this N400 effect. Again, we think it has to do with this agent bias that's in perception. Now, the effect breaks down with inanimates, which is interesting because it recalls something that we observed with the other primates as well. While with inanimates, the agent preference becomes shaky or disappears. In Hindi, it persisted. In Aiwo, in this language here in the Solomon Islands, it didn't. So the conclusion is we don't know under what conditions exactly this breaking down happens of the inanimates, but what we do infer is that at least for human reference, there is a perceptually grounded agent bias. So this led us to the hypothesis that this perceptually grounded agent bias would transiently prefer an agent interpretation in comprehension, and so would prefer sentences that follow this pattern. And if they don't, like in the experimental stimuli, that there is always a temptation to reanalyze this initial noun phrase as denoting an agent. Now, that would be good if the language indeed had these cases. And so we developed from this the hypothesis that this perceptual bias causes an evolutionary bias towards nominative agents placed initially in a sentence. So towards noun phrases that have no special case marking or unmarked and denote either an intransitive subject or a transitive agent. And again, we test this with the same kind of methods that I showed you for the labiodental study. We fitted models on language trees. Here we did it more extensively because also we assume this is at greater time depth. And what we found when we look at when we take the overview of entire families and look at their evolutionary biases in terms of these, transition probability rates, we found that in all the continents we looked at, the bias towards nominative expression of agents is much more likely than a bias towards ergative marked agents, which would go against this perception principle. So the conclusion from this case study is that here a biologically grounded perception of preferring agents has an impact on comprehension as we go, transiently, very briefly, before doing all the integration at the end when you hear the entire sentence. And this prompts speakers into reanalysis of unmarked cases as denoting agents rather than as something else like patients. This drives a bias worldwide towards nominative agents and against ergative cases. Again, the case does not rest on the current distribution, which, as I said in the beginning, might fool us, but it's now developed from a perception principle that leads to a hypothesis that we can then test directly in terms of the dynamics of language change across the world. Now, I spoke a lot about perception, and the question always comes up, what about production? And I want to say a few things about this because it's instructive and tells us also where not to find biologically grounded evolutionary biases, but culturally determined biases, because this is just as important. I forgot to say, we also replicated all this for the claim that, or the hypothesis that initial noun phrase tend to be agents and then are followed by patients. Actually, we modeled this on the basis of Indo-European only for now, but the good thing is we, or our PhD student Yingqi Jing, did this based on corpus data because, grammar data on word order are usually a bit deceptive. So we looked at corpus data and modeled the evolutionary trends and again confirmed the idea that agents are placed before patients, and that is a preferred state in the evolutionary dynamics of at least Indo-European, and we're now testing this on further language families, but I'm hopeful and optimistic that this will be corroborated in many other language families where we can actually test this. Anyway, I said I wanted to go to production as well because it's very instructive. Here, the game is an entirely different one than in perception. In perception, it makes sense to assume that you have an underlying perception system and language data is just like visual data, something that comes in that needs to be processed. In production, you plan. You plan ahead. You have to prepare your message. You have to, structure it and turn it into a sentence that you can, obeying the rules of grammar and everything. And one of the things that many people have remarked upon is so extremely important for planning and production is the time pressure we are under. As Steve Levinson has pointed out a few years ago, this time pressure is enormous because we tend to respond within 200 milliseconds, which again is not enough to plan even a single word, right? You need more. In fact, you need a couple seconds even. So it must happen very efficiently because you do it while listening, right? So it must be something that is great. And one thing that is great for planning is to stay flexible, that you can adjust because you don't know yet where you want to go. So you just want to plan something and then be able to change your plans on the fly, maybe because now you get the right input because the other person says something different than you expected the person to say. And one thing that is great for this is nominatives. So think you want to utter something about this picture, make a sentence out of it in Hindi. And if you start with a nominative like Mali, there is a whole different ways you can continue. You can continue intransitively with crouches or in the past tense crouched, or you could continue with plants trees. If you start with an ergative, you are locked. There's no, you can't get out anymore. You have your ergative. It's the only way you can continue with the past tense transitive sentence. So for the planning system, nominatives are wonderful. Now, this is, you think this is a just so story, but actually there is now, we have neurobiological evidence that really this happens, that we tend to use these nominatives to keep open our bets and possibilities. We know that because we recently were able to show that the brain activities, oscillatory activities that happen when you plan a nominative in Hindi, as opposed to an ergative, that's where it's called unmarked, but the unmarked case, when you plan unmarked case, the nominative, then you see an oscillatory pattern that's called event-related desynchronization, which is a power loss in a certain frequency band of brain oscillations, the alpha band. This power loss in the alpha band is known, this event-related desynchronization is independently known as a signal for maintaining and distinguishing multiple plans at the same time, even outside language planning. So what I just said is probably something that really happens in the brain. So we use nominatives, we need to keep open our plans. It's not a just so story, it's really something that happens. So this suggests that from the point of view of sentence planning, of language production, what matters is to stay flexible. But clearly staying flexible is only one aspect of sentence planning. There is also content you want to plan, and the content you want to plan obviously also matters because you want to get out what's salient, what's most important to the conversation first. This is a point that MacDonald made in a great review paper in Frontiers some time ago. As you pointed out, that the planning system, because again under this time pressure, wants to spit out the most salient and important information first. And this goes well with the finding that Erik Meyer and colleagues published a few years ago on sign languages, because they found that, to the surprise of many, in sign languages, often you don't get subject initial word orders, but object initial word orders. But you get them, interestingly, precisely when these are human reference, because human reference matter more, right? So you want to get the humans first and not the agents first. So this is completely different from what we saw on the perception side, where I said we had a perceptual bias to assign an agent role to what comes in first. That's different from communicating what you want to say. What you want to say is something that matters, the most salient things first, and you want to do this in the most flexible way possible so as to cope with that time pressure you get. And this also goes very well with the finding that, with other findings, for instance, Susan Golden-Meadow has pointed out, has found that in home signers, which have no linguistic input whatsoever, you get a surprising prevalence of object-verb-subject orders. Again, this is the interpretation we're proposing. This has to do with the saliency of the object, especially in examples like the one you see here, where the subject is really a pronoun that is obviously just there. So the saliency of the first element matters. This is what goes first. It has nothing to do with the agent preference, because that's perception only. And planning noun phrases really is something driven by what you want to say, and also, importantly, what you are allowed to say, because this is something we have looked at a long time ago. In some languages, using noun phrases is a delicate social business, and there is a conventional pressure in the culture of not doing it. This is in Balthasar, where we found that Balthasar, in contrast to other languages, reduces the amount of NPs. Or another finding is the one by Sandra Duranti on Samoan from the 90s, where he observed that using noun phrases in the ergative case, where you attribute agency to a human reference specifically, that's reserved for the elite. That's only senior people are allowed to do, not children, not lower members of the society. They do this much less. And also there is a strong ideology in the community of not doing it. It's bad behavior. So whether what you plan first and what you plan at all is a matter of cultural conventions, has nothing to do with our biological conditions, unlike the perception. And of course, that's another finding we had. Planning noun phrases is difficult business. right? It's difficult business because of the cultural constraints that I mentioned, because of the flexibility constraints that I mentioned. It all has an effect. And that's one that we found a few years ago and worked with Frank Seifert and others, where we found that it's much more likely to have a brief pause before uttering noun phrases and to slow down a bit before uttering noun phrases. So it all comes together and drives home the point that indeed noun phrases are a difficult thing to plan, and whether or not you use them and what word order you use eventually is driven by this set of concerns and not by perception. And the perception mechanism operates completely independently of this. And it's indeed independent of this because, as I emphasized, we see the perception bias played out in language comprehension as measurable through EEG, even when the frequencies in actual language use go completely against this. You know, when you use patience much more commonly in initial position and like in the object initial case, or when the default interpretation of an ambiguous noun phrase in Basque tends to be a patient, even then the agent preference in perception kicks in. So it's independent of this. All right, I should wrap up and come to the conclusions. So the methodological take-home message is that, as I said at the beginning, I think we should stop counting and interpreting language types if we want to find out what is culturally driven and what is biologically driven about the human language faculty, and should in turn to what I call evolutionary biases, or you can also avoid the term, but the idea is that we look at causal relationships between something in the biology or something in the culture and how it plays out in the dynamics of language, of how languages change over time, and that we can measure there and test. I've presented but here we go. But the first one I showed was the condition of overbite and overjet persistence into adulthood that started with agriculture in the post-Neolithic. It's a change from C is for culture here. Culture changes the biology here, kind of food we get and the biomechanics of our bite, and this in turn has an effect on language. Then I presented a case study where I think we have an agent bias that's rooted in perception, probably evolved a very long time ago. We seem to share the same bias as chicken, so that would put us into amniote clade. So it's maybe something that evolved much earlier as a perception system, but is still relevant today because it still leaves an effect on our language processing system, which in turn biases languages towards initial nominative coded agents. And finally, I turn to the time pressure in planning as a condition that must have evolved with rapid turn taking. Now, when that happened, we don't know, but presumably somewhere in the evolution of the Homo genus, maybe only sapiens, we really don't know, but in this kind of time frame, other primates don't have it. They don't have this rapid turn taking. They're much slower when they take turns, like it's known for marmosets, for example. In this case, it's probably the time pressure and the way of coping with this co-evolved together with this rapid turn taking and had an effect on language. But here it's not the systematic effect because it's not just saying the salient stuff first. It's not only the flexible stuff first, but also saying the salient stuff first, as we saw. And that, of course, varies culturally. So taking this all together, I think with this approach and with these case studies, we are gradually inching a bit towards being able to distinguish to what extent language is shaped by our biological given and to what extent it is the output of our cultural evolution over historical time, which is the big question I started out with. And on that note, I would like to conclude, and I will be happy to take questions. Thank you. And thanks to my team.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you for the talk. I have to apologize. My computer crashed halfway through your talk, so I can have to reconstruct bits of what you said. I'm just going to take a quick look at the chat. And I'd like to start by going back to the start of what you talked about. And you were talking about the problem of population history overwriting variation, and that sort of skewing our view of what's possible in language in a global sense. So I was wondering if that's something about that biologists, is that a problem that they also have? And is the sort of neo-Darwinian approach to evolution, is that the kind of program that you're mirroring? So in a sense, like there are a large number of extinct species, but biologists aren't typically worried about making claims about causal processes of adaptation. They don't need those extinct species to be able to do that. So is there a parallel there, or do we need to rewind time to find those extinct stuff, or can you do it without? Can you do your program?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, on the one hand, the situation I think is a bit different, because our worry is, I think, should be more like the frequency distributions and not the presence or absence of certain types. I mean, one thing where biological evolution really is different from language is that once you have a successful solution in biology and the niche, the ecology stays, then it won't change. Take sharks. Right? But in language, things you have much more of like reversals, and things deviate again because you have competing pressures. And so in biology, obviously it's an issue if we didn't know about sharks, we will miss something, but it wouldn't affect our conclusions about like other things in the animal kingdom. Whereas with languages, if we miss certain constellations of features, I don't know, object initial plus ergative place plus clicks, I don't think that exists. That would be the shark, right? But if we miss this, that's not a big problem. But what is a big problem is that we misjudge the frequency distributions of the things that we know of the individual areas. So I think the problem is a bit differently positioned in the two areas, but I clearly see an overlap, and I think this is also what you are asking, or a parallel in the sense that it's the processes that matter much more than the outcomes. Right? Really want to reconstruct the processes and not the results.
Yeah. So maybe linked to that then. Given that there are these biases in language, and you've mentioned this, but I just want to push you a bit further. Why don't we see more? Why do we see the non-preferred types still in language? So there are lots of different possibilities. One is that there are just competing biases, and that the bias isn't very strong. Another one is that there's a large element of random change, or just very slow change. Languages were adapted to one thing a long time ago, and they've been slowly changing. Or like you said, that there are just new cultural environments appear. So the use of NPs being taboo would be a sort of new cultural environment that would argue against these stuff. So do any of those things, is it for each story, do we have to try and figure out what the most relevant one is? Or do you think some are actually more likely to be relevant for linguists?
And that's a really tough question and a very good one. I think we need to and should really put effort in trying to tease apart, especially the counter or the relative contribution of randomness, which I think is really much underappreciated in language sciences, because just because of the social function of language, right? I mean, it's so great to have language evolves in a Darwinian modified descent schema. I think we all agree on that, but that also creates just random stuff, and that helps people to distinguish themselves socially, and that matters so much. I mean, we see it every day, like in lexical changes among youth groups and stuff, right? So I think that is certainly an enormous component here. You move away, make new cases, grammaticalize new stuff, just through essentially random mechanisms. But then the other,
sorry to stop you there, but a lot of, at least the way I was reading it, a lot of early linguistics assumed that change was very random. Mm-hmm. And social linguistics have been trying to sort of push the idea that a lot of change is directed, and they would use social differentiation as a kind of directed change. So are we talking about two things? Because there are biases in selection, and then there are biases in mutation. Mm-hmm. So a particular word to mark a community might come about at random, but then the selection would be very active by that community.
Yeah, I think there's a slight misunderstanding. What I had in mind is randomness in the sense of what it is that is used for a special social purpose is random. So in one community, it might be using, I don't know, less vowels is more polite. In the next community, using more vowels is more polite. There is no intrinsic association. That's what I had in mind. So so the actual structures are not tied to social preferences. But the other component that you mentioned, I think, is just as important. I mean, from our work on agent expressions, I think what for me is like one of the most important lessons is indeed that from the point of view of cultural evolution, it's that there are these local and quite varied constraints on using, say, ergatives, right, as something that's socially valued in a community. So I would imagine that for the Samoan society, if the Durantis interpretation and ethnography still holds in modern society, that under such circumstances you don't want to lose an ergative. It's so loaded, right? It's like it's really, really important for the community, and that is, of course, keeps it staying. And then the perception bias can't have an effect. It's completely overridden. It will always be there, and I hope we can test this in the sense that run the EG experiment in Samoa. But after having seen this in so many languages now, I would be surprised if they didn't have this effect, which would bias against the ergatives, but then here culture overrides.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a combination of those, and it's the changing cultural landscape that you see as a kind of changing. Yeah. Okay. But then these. Yeah. I was wondering if a lot of your work depends on having estimates of the historical relationships between languages to sort of see how these things, biases, play out over time. We need good estimates of how languages are related. But your causal stories themselves, do they alter the picture of what that history is? So a lot of historical reconstruction is based on if they have models of sound change and lexical change. If you add in the kinds of mechanisms that you're talking about, would our picture of the history of languages change? So a very, very simple idea is part of the reconstruction of languages. If you have two languages that have the same word order, you might be tempted to think that they are more closely related in time. Is my question clear?
Yeah, at least the main part. I'm not so sure about the example you just gave, but let me first maybe answer to the main part, because yes, in the sense, there is one sense where it's a clear yes, because having explicit models of say perception biases can lead to the form of explicit generative models of language change, because you then can make direct predictions of what you would like to see in the data, and then you can test them straightforwardly. But that doesn't. So this is a bit like in laboratory phonology, where people also have very good causal stories about like the origins of sound change, like thinking here of Ohala's work or Juliette Levin's work, which makes clear predictions of which sound changes should be more likely than others. And you could now actually take these. I don't think this happens to the extent it could happen right now, but we could now also take these models and turn them into models of change at the large scale and test them on the phylogenies that we have with time depth and so on. Whether this helps in deciding between reconstructions, which I think was your second aspect of your question, I think here I think we can make great progress in moving away a bit from decisions and towards a more probabilistic understanding of reconstructions. This is what we tried to do when we introduced this method of stochastic character mapping that has had great successes in biology, and used it for language, because we will never know whether what's written as W asterisk was pronounced labiodental or not by speakers of this one language called Indo-European. But we can make estimates. And so that's, I think, what historical linguistics could profit quite a bit from.
Yeah. Nice. I'm just going to check chat quickly. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the program more generally. One of the questions is about flexible and salient noun phrases. And the question is how this applies to verb initial languages. So a lot of the work you were showing was talking about the order of the subject and the object. How does this work out when the verb is initial? Does that make sense in this sort of paradigm of salience and preference?
Yeah. So from the production side, I think it does really, because even if you plan the verb initially, of course, it has a consequence, because you are much less flexible indeed, right? Because you fix your argument structure right away. But then whether or not you realize the arguments lexically, overtly, that's then a choice of your cultural norms about saliency and what to say and what not to say. That's from the production side. From the perception side, verb initial languages are just a world apart, right? Because there, the agent bias of perception that we saw cannot even play out, because if you've seen the verb, then you have an argument structure immediately projected, and that predetermines what you will see. Very much so. In fact, there have been experiments on the agent preference, but more generally subject preference with verb initial languages, and lo and behold, they didn't find this, right? But it's not a surprise, because the game is just a very different one.
Yeah. Another question. So if we find similarities between chicken primates and humans, does this suggest a common source, or is it the product of evolutionary convergence? I have a couple of follow-up questions about that. So quickly, what's your view on that?
It's a great question, and I wish we had the answer. I really think we don't. Right now, I suspect it's. I mean, my bet is that it is a joint thing. It's not just a parallelism, not just convergence. because but that's just so story. I think it just makes so much sense to have like a agent perception bias, because agents matter. They are dangerous potentially. I mean, it's good for survival to immediately spot agents, because they could approach you, they could eat you, they could do stuff to you. So it might be something that evolved very early. But that's just so story. We will need to we need to do more experiments on agent perception across different mammals, about different birds. What we have now is really only chicken and primates, and that clearly is not enough.
I mean, so I was wondering, I mean, you may have addressed this in the part where my computer exploded, but to what extent could the human bias be a product of learning, just by observing the world and learning about the relative frequency of agents?
Yeah, that's great. That's actually the very reason why we started to do the comparative experiments now, because we really want to know to what extent this agent bias replicates, and to what extent it's really the same between different primates. Because indeed, it could be that it's different, and that apes perceive the world differently, and maybe not with as clear a bias as we found. Yeah. But we'll see. I mean, as I said, these results are hot off the field, and we'll see how it turns out. And maybe it's also different between different primate species. Maybe the gorillas really are different. We'll have to see. I'm really very curious every day about the next batch of results.
Would it be sort of in keeping with your program to then think about, all right, are there any human societies, any human ecological niches where we might expect the agent bias to be reversed or to be reduced somehow because of some particular cultural practice?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. No, and it's actually part of ongoing research, precisely because we want to test the limits of it. So we want to. That's actually one of the reasons why we turned to where we did this brief exposure experiments, where we flash, very briefly, and then we did this comparing Spanish and Basque, because the idea was that perhaps indeed Basque, by highlighting agents specifically with a case marker, and so if you grow up learning Basque, you're constantly get this additional marking, so that agents are kind of salient more. They are picked out as something special, and in Basque, it's really the role, because this has this split S or active system, right? It's really agents that are ergative. So you learn this constantly, and so we thought that, well, maybe this indeed has an effect, that Basque speakers, that the agent preference is increased in Basque speakers, and then it was. We have a difference, right? But it's just like both our Spanish and Basque speakers perceive agents much better than patients, but Basque speakers are even better than Spanish speakers. And so indeed, cultural evolutionary patterns, like the evolution of certain case markers, can change the biases, can influence them, which is really, because it's really interesting, because it raises all sorts of questions. To what extent, how is it possible if something is biologically rooted, like shared with other amniotes at that level, can be modulated by culture? And that's an interesting phenomenon, which, I mean, it's not unheard of. Us humans are great in changing our nature and nature all over fundamentally, but really interfering through cultural evolution without technology in the basic perception mechanisms, that's quite something, and really interesting, I find.
Yeah, and in particular, I think sociolinguistics, because a lot about interacting with other humans is demonstrating you're willing to pay a cost, or investing in someone, making an effort. So like, rhyming songs is very difficult, but people appreciate them. And that seems to work directly against the cognitive biases for simpler, faster processing stuff. So is it in that interactive niche that you would expect the biggest variations to come about, all these little deviations?
I mean, certainly Absolutely. I mean, certainly from what I've presented today, that would be clearly the conclusion, right? That because it's, this business about using noun phrases and ergative noun phrases, this clearly comes from how we interact and how we construct our social boundaries and group allegiances and so on. So clearly this interactive niche would have an important role in that, but I suspect it's not only that, right? It's also, it can also just be indeed random developments, in a sense that you end up with a grammar that just doesn't play well with what you expect perceptually.
And so finally, I just want to ask you about how you see this kind of programming working practically. So, and I mean, first of all, I think that you're not saying this is the only thing that linguists should be doing. That there are plenty of, like, we need field work and we need phonology and all of that kind of stuff. That these things work in parallel with other types of explanation, and that's something that Martin Haspelmath has been talking about recently. Is that right?
No, yeah. I'm not sure about the explanation notion here, but of course, none of this research is possible without intensive language documentation, intensive field work. It's clearly the basis. None of this is possible without careful psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic experimentation. That's clearly the case. Nothing is possible without careful philology and assessment of states of languages also in historical time, and then developing models of language change and fitting them on trees. This is clearly all absolutely mission critical for even making the slightest progress. In Zurich, we try to bring this all together under one umbrella, sort of, to bring this research under one group. I'm not sure about the explanation part. In a way, I mean, I guess when it comes to explanation in language, we all want to know what does it mean? It means like coming up with the factors that might explain why languages are the way they are. That's the usual way this is pitched. And then what could there be, right? Random, then something in the biology or something in the culture. There's not much else beyond these three. And that's why I started this presentation by saying, how can we really tease these apart? And I think what we really should worry more about is looking at distribution, say A is more frequent than B, or even implications, A to B is more common than A to C or something, whatever, doesn't matter. Because it doesn't probe the mechanisms. We end with just so stories, just post hoc explanations. Every next linguist can come up with an alternative story. And it's really, I mean, you've written about this extensively, about this more idiographic approach where we tell each other stories, and of course, yeah, it's inspiring. And I am not saying I'm not saying we should stop this, because it clearly generates interesting hypotheses, and I learn a lot from reading this literature, because every day when I read this, maybe one should. But then there's the point, one should do an experiment on X and Y, or one should test this really, rather than just saying, here is a plausible explanation, and the next linguist, I don't find this really plausible because I have something more plausible. That's, I guess, what I want to say.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, in the last half of your talk, the interesting thing I found was that you were using examples of studies that didn't aim to be part of your program,
right?
That were answering slightly different questions, but it's still evidence for the kinds of things that you're looking for. So I think, yeah, there are obviously valuable links between someone who's doing a very careful bit of field work, that can still be evidence for the types of things that you're looking at. I think that's
absolutely. If then further tested, right? That's I see it more like as a basis, a foundation, as a something that starts a project.
So then I wanted to ask you, what, like, practically, as someone who directs research and teaches linguistics, what should the teachers be doing if we believe in this program and we want to pursue it? What should the teachers be doing? What should students be learning? Because a lot of what you were presenting is actually quite far away from traditional linguistics.
Yeah.
And I saw a response of yours to a criticism of the labiodental study that was almost entirely statistics and computation, and very, very technical and complex, which is worth doing. But there's a huge investment of time for a linguist to be able to engage with that stuff. So I just thought, how do you see the future of linguistics as a study?
Yeah, I think we need to accept the fact that just like what happened in biology a long time ago, we need to we'll end up with different subdisciplines that need to do well what they can do well, and I certainly see a gigantic room for descriptive linguistics and fieldwork-based linguistics that just analyzes languages, and for that you need the classical linguistic training. Except that also that needs to be enhanced. I think it's very important to monitor very closely the rapid developments in speech recognition. Maybe some of you saw this announcement from Facebook where they have this zero-shot learning of transcription, right? So there's enormous developments there that clearly need to be leveraged because they could be a true game changer in fieldwork-based linguistics. But that clearly is very important and needs to go on. Same on philology, which I think, essentially fieldwork just on dead texts rather than live speakers, but clearly absolutely critical and needs to be developed. And I don't expect in the future that the same people have to do everything, just like in biology, your behavioral biologist doing playback experiments with some animals in somewhere is not the same as developing the latest mathematical models of evolution. I mean, that's and there it's become common that you just work together, that you build large teams, and then you can do very interesting stuff. And I see no reason why language science cannot move in that direction as well. So we need to diversify and also accept that there's different interests, different foci, and each of them is important, but they also need to understand they don't do the same business. So what I often find a bit not so productive is that when someone describes a language and then says, and we have this pattern because, and then you read a page of speculation about human cognition. I don't think that brings us any further, because we don't need that. Because in order to say something about human cognition, we need something entirely different, and we need experiments on human cognition. And experiment on human cognition means experiments not on one speaker from one community, but really worldwide, comparative. And so this speculation, I think this is what, and it has characterized our field for a long time, that people have made observations and then quickly there is a so-called cognitive interpretation where we don't even know what people mean when they say cognition. So that's a bit, so once that's clear, then I think the future is wonderful, because then we can go back and start really collaborating across these subdisciplines, which we really need to.
Yeah, and that clearly comes through very clearly in your research in this last slide with all your collaborators. And yeah, the ability to find a language that would really test the thing that you want and be able to work with people who can give you access to that kind of thing is really impressive. So I'll just quickly check if there are no more questions. Thank you for giving us this wonderful talk and talking to me. On behalf of, I'm going to get this right, the Aberlin Ao Vivo Linguistics Online, on behalf of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. Thank you to everyone who was listening.
Well, thank everybody for listening as well from my side, and thanks, Sean, for the great discussion, and thanks the organizers of Ao Vivo Online for having me, and it was really great to be able to give this talk. Thank you all.